Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, April the 3rd, 2024. Regular viewers, listeners of Keen On know that we've been doing quite a lot of shows on the increasingly fashionable role of psychedelics in people's lifestyles and thinking. We did a show a couple of months ago with Andy Mitchell, a UK-based writer. He has a new book out, 10 Trips, The New Reality of Psychedelics. He also did a show last year with a California-based novelist, William Brewer, who has a new novel out, The Red Arrow, about the use of psychedelics. So we're back on that subject again today with a book appropriately named Tripped: Nazi Germany, the CIA, and the Dawn of the Psychedelic Age by Norman Ohler. Many of you will be familiar with Ohler. He wrote a book a few years ago, Blitz, Drugs in the Third Reich. It came out in 2017. It's hugely successful, quite controversial too. Not all historians agreed with his conclusions, but it certainly had a big impact. And Norman Ohler is joining us from Three Bridges in Germany. I'm not going to try Norman with the German pronunciation because I will embarrass myself. Are you, before we get on to Tripped, your new book, are you surprised with the new fashion of psychedelics? It's becoming increasingly mainstream. I know actually a few German entrepreneurs, for example, who have startup companies built around psychedelics.
I mean, the interest in psychedelics is not really surprising because these compounds are actually quite interesting. So for many reasons, it's natural that people are trying to examine how they could be used. What is surprising is that research was actually prohibited for many decades since, for example, LSD became illegal in the mid-60s. So that is actually surprising. Now the laws are softening. Some states within the United States legalize certain compounds. Europe is going the same way. Germany just legalized nationwide cannabis 2 days ago. That is actually not surprising because the prohibition laws are not based on scientific findings, but are based on ideological reasoning. And this slowly comes out of style, and scientists are now actually looking from an objective point of view at these substances. So that is not surprising to me. I actually find it quite a natural development.
Yeah, and I think judging from your book, Tripped, it's out next week, Nazi Germany, the CIA, and the Dawn of the Psychedelic Age, would it be fair that you place psychedelics or the history of psychedelics in the context of the origins of the Cold War and the various paranoias driving the Cold War, particularly in the United States?
Absolutely. If we think of psychedelic compounds, we usually think of the 60s and how people, like hundreds of thousands of people were just using them, and Timothy Leary said, just take enough LSD and then you'll be against the Vietnam War and the world will be perfect. I mean, that's our first association with these drugs. But actually, they have a longer history. LSD was discovered in 1943, and the company who discovered it, a Swiss pharmaceutical company, put great hopes into LSD as a molecule. They thought they could, develop a medicine against mental illnesses, against neuroses, against traumata, against dementia. All of these problems that we are facing today, we were also facing. Mankind was also, especially modern mankind, was also facing back then. So I was looking in Tripped at what actually happened in those very early years of LSD. Why was the Swiss pharmaceutical company not able to bring it out as a medicine and turn it into, a big hit, which is what they believed LSD would be?
To what extent, as I said, many of our viewers and listeners will be familiar with your remarkable book, Blitzed: Drugs in the Third Reich, which was enormously successful. To what extent is this new book, Tripped, the second volume. How is it connected with Blitzed, or are they separate narratives, separate stories?
They are separate stories, so you don't need to be familiar with Blitzed in order to read Tripped, but they are also connected, because while I was researching for Blitzed, I visited many archives, and one of them was the archive of the former concentration camp of Dachau, which is now like a memorial, kind of a museum that people can visit to get informed about what was actually happening in the camp. And the archivist told me, because I was interested in Nazis and drugs, that's the topic of Blitz, the first book. The archivist told me that actually the SS conducted psychedelic research at the camp, and this was totally new to me. This had actually never been properly examined before. So I became interested in it. I thought it would be a chapter on Blitz, and actually is a very small chapter in Blitz, but there was a lot more to the story, which I was not able to properly research at the time, but I thought this has to be a separate book. I want to, because the archivist said, I don't know where the reports are. The American forces, when they liberated the camp, took the reports about the psychedelic research with them. So we don't have it. So I was searching for what actually happened, why they did psychedelic research, and why America got so interested in it. That was not possible during the research of Bliss, because it just took longer. This is now the new book, Trip. So yes, they are connected.
It adds to that very troubling narrative of the United States and its security agencies somehow succeeding the Nazis, borrowing their technology. From Oppenheimer and other movies about the American invention of nuclear weapons, we know that the Americans borrowed technology and scientists from the Nazis. Is there a parallel there, this odd continuity between Nazi Germany and Cold War America?
It basically starts with a guy called Harry J. Anslinger, who was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he was very interested in the Nazis' anti-drug laws, because the Nazis were the first really anti-drug government, you could say, even though they abused drugs, methamphetamine, for their army later on. When they started in 1933, they proclaimed themselves to be a government that will rid society of all drugs, and they were quite harsh about it. Drug users were sent to concentration camps. They used the anti-drug laws against morphine, heroin, cocaine, these kind of drugs. They used these laws to persecute Jews from early on, because in the beginning they didn't have laws against Jews. They just had anti-drug laws. So they concluded they could just, through racial profiling, attack that part of the German population. And weirdly enough, this approach appealed to Harry J. Anslinger, who was basically the drug czar of America, who was responsible for the prohibition. He basically invented the anti-drug policies in the United States, because he was trying to fight the jazz scene in Harlem, and he knew he couldn't arrest Afro-Americans just because they're Afro-American, but if he made marijuana illegal, which he did, and then he could arrest jazz players who used a lot of marijuana, and he was actually able to hassle quite a lot of people. Billie Holiday, he tried to ruin the career of Billie Holiday. So he was really using these racist foundations on which the Nazi anti-drug policies were built. He imported them to the United States, and no one really stopped him. Republican presidents supported his anti-drug policies. Democratic presidents supported his anti-drug policies. So he was actually in office for decades. Only Hoover, the FBI director, was longer in office than
and that raises, of course, the complicated and controversial subject of J. Edgar Hoover, who was also an aggressive anti-communist and a racist, very supportive of a lot of the Jim Crow laws, or it seems controversial figure. So are you suggesting, Norman, that there is this odd symmetry between US state policy and Nazi German policy?
Certainly the United States is a different system than Nazi Germany. It's not a totalitarian dictatorship. But we can see that certain the Nazis were kind of obviously infamous, but also in America there was the belief that they had quite a vast knowledge, for example, in developing a nuclear weapon, and that they had knowledge that could be useful in the emerging Cold War, which the United States suddenly found itself in against the Soviet Union. It was all about, who's on my side, who's on the other side, who's a traitor, how could we extract secrets. It was a time of suspicion, of paranoia. So when the Americans found out that the Germans were actively researching LSD and mescaline, doing psychedelic research in the concentration camp of Dachau, when they found this out, when they liberated Dachau and found all the reports, this became very interesting to the American first military and then American intelligence service. Like they were wondering, can we now use LSD as a weapon? Obviously, this doesn't make the Americans the same as the Nazis, but there are certain, behaviors or policies that the US was actually quite happy to adopt. And I think it's very important to, shed light on this and understand what actually happened within that pressure cooker of the Cold War, and how that might actually have, even damaged possibly the democracy, the democratic evolvement of the American society.
Remind us, Norman, of you touched on this earlier in our conversation. How was LSD used at Dachau? How, specifically, what did Nazi scientists, or quote unquote Nazi scientists, researchers use LSD for in death camps, industrial death camps like Dachau?
The pipe dream or the wet dream of the Nazis, especially of the Gestapo and of the SS, was to find a so-called truth serum, especially after the attempt on Hitler's life on July 20th, 1944, Operation Valkyrie.
Which you just wrote a novel about, right? Or something you're all too familiar with that too.
Well, I describe it in detail in Blitzed. After this event, paranoia was everywhere within the state system, like the SS and the Nazi Party, obviously. Who is a traitor? Because that was the army going against Hitler. So that was for the Nazis, this was treason. So they had to find out who are the traitors in the German army, who still works for us and who is actually has to be eliminated. So the search for the truth serum was quite an important search, and researchers were involved in that. And there was one SS officer involved in that. Plötner was his name, and he carried out these tests in Dachau on inmates without telling them. Like, he invited them to a barrack, gave them a cup of coffee, which was a luxury in the camp, and put something, spiked the coffee, and then when the effects of the psychedelic drug, and these effects are quite strong. That's why in Germany the book's called The Strongest Stuff, because LSD, for example, is the strongest substance we know working on the human mind. So when these effects were taking place, the SS guy would kind of like, I imagine him like kind of smiling. I mean, using his knowledge that he has given something to the inmate that the inmate doesn't know about, to start, becoming overpowering in the interview, and maybe being able to subtract all kinds of all the information you need, basically.
I mean, the camps in themselves obviously are profoundly chilling, but it adds to the chilling quality of the Nazis using what you call the ideal of truth serum to find out more about the inmates. I mean, what would the inmates have said that the Nazis didn't already know?
Well, these were tests just trying to figure out whether it's possible to manipulate a person through the use of psychedelic drugs. Like, they were not interested in the test subjects, but they wanted to find like a protocol for interrogation using drugs to enhance the results of the interrogation. And this is something that then the Americans were also happy to, further develop, because this is interesting basically to any intelligence service. How can we get better in interrogating someone? Because through torture, you can only get so far. The Nazis realized they could torture people. The SS, they tortured like Polish resistance fighters, especially seemed to have been a problem. They just wouldn't talk. no matter what cruelty was administered onto them. So the idea was maybe we give them LSD and we kind of break their mind, and then we actually achieve better results. Those were the obviously highly unethical human experiments that this SS officer Plötner did in Dachau.
Yeah, it's a chilling narrative. More than chilling, it's a surreally chilling narrative. What about you wrote in Blitzed about Nazi use of drugs? Did the Nazi officers, the Nazi hierarchy, did they experiment with LSD?
I didn't find any records of that, and I highly doubt it. I mean, LSD was not really known at the time, and that is the interesting story I was able to uncover in Tripped, I think. How did the Nazis actually hear about LSD? I mean, LSD was a bizarre molecule that the Swiss company, not a German company, a Swiss company in neutral Switzerland discovered in 1943. So how did it travel? That's what
this
I
is
wanted.
A company called Sandoz, which now is a part of Novartis. So it's very much a kosher, so to speak, pharmaceutical company.
Yeah,
is that right, Norman?
Yeah, I mean, Sandoz was one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in Europe, and now it's Novartis. It's one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Their wealth or their power or their status is based on ergot, which is a fungus that grows on rye. And Sandoz was able in the 1920s to develop medicines out of this ergot fungus, like migraine medicine, something against migraine, something that was given to women who gave birth to make the blood vessels contract again after the birth was given, so the bleeding stops. So they made a lot of profit with ergot medicines, and then LSD was also an ergot. It's also made from ergot, but it works on the mind. It doesn't work on the body. The first time Albert Hofmann, the chemist who discovered it, took it, he thought he was going insane, and he called his doctor, and he was telling him he's seeing like his perceptions completely changed. His doctor examined his body and didn't find anything at all. So this was a completely new type of medicine. And the interesting thing that I researched is that the CEO of Sandoz communicated this invention with his best buddy, Richard Kuhn, who was the leading Nazi biochemist living in Heidelberg and doing research on the very truth serum we talked about for the Nazis. And then suddenly Stoll, his friend, they knew each other from the 1920s, so they were old buddies. They were always sharing their research. He suddenly hears that in Basel, they discovered this strange thing called LSD. It works potently on the mind. I need to examine this. And then Stoll actually sent him 0.5 gram of ergotamine, which is the precursor to LSD, from Basel, Switzerland to Heidelberg, Germany. And then the Nazi biochemist had this potent substance in his hand. And then the tests in Dachau were designed. So it was actually a mistake in a way by the CEO of the company to share this information with the wrong people, because at the time he probably didn't even judge the Nazis, in 1943. Switzerland was, at the one hand they were dealing with Nazi Germany, on the other hand they were dealing with the Western Allies. Like they were neutral. They were not on either side. And this proved to bring LSD on the wrong track, because now it was examined as a weapon, and Sandoz had great problems in the future to bring it out as a medicine as they first had intended.
Astonishing story. We're speaking with Norman Ohler, a distinguished German writer, New York Times best-selling writer. Many of you will be familiar with his book Blitzed. He has a new book out, Tripped: Nazi Germany, the CIA, and the Dawn of the Psychedelic Age. We're going to talk more about the CIA and the dawn of the psychedelic age after the break. But I want to remind everyone that guys like Norman Ohler are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, an excellent new quarterly journal of culture and politics, going to run a short feature on Liberties. And then we'll be back with Norman to talk more about LSD and the Cold War. Don't go away, anyone.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Norman Ohler, the German-based author of Tripped, Fascinating New History, a follow-up to Blitzed, Tripped, Nazi Germany, the CIA, and the Dawn of the Psychedelic Age. So, Norman, 1945, the Nazis are defeated. Is this the dawn of the psychedelic age for you, when the Nazis fall and the Americans move into Berlin?
I mean, it could be the dawn of the psychedelic age. At Sandoz, they installed kind of a tripping room within the company, which is kind of unusual for a Swiss pharmaceutical company, but they wanted to know what LSD can actually do, and they invited people from the company, chemists, but also like bookkeepers, secretaries, to just come in the room and take LSD and then describe what they were experiencing. And the secretary was typing it all up, and people were only experiencing only had amazing experiences. Like they said, I never felt so good. I can finally think clearly about my life. I'm so happy I'm taking this. I understand now what it means to be human. I see, like they looked out the window, I see nature with different eyes. So Sandoz really thought this is going to be a big hit. And then the next step was to test it on patients. And the son of the CEO, he was a professor at University Clinic in Zurich. He tested it on depressed patients, on traumatized people from the war. And also the results were very good. So in a way, that was the dawn of the psychedelic age. But then this dawn actually was a very slow dawn, and a dusk actually followed, because LSD kind of got under the wings of the CIA eventually. Research was tainted. Then it was made illegal by the Nixon administration. LSD was included in the infamous war on drugs. So the psychedelic age officially was over. People were using it more than ever. This is when LSD became illegal and became this kind of street drug or party drug or drug for gatherings and for the anti-Vietnam War movement. This is not what Hoffman and the Sandoz company thought would happen with LSD. They were completely surprised that now suddenly they couldn't make it anymore for the market, and illegal LSD chemists were making it illegally, distributing it, like millions of people were using LSD, and are still today using LSD. But since the early 90s, it was for the first time possible again to do clinical research. This was done in Switzerland by a professor named Vollenweider. Like, he gave people LSD and psilocybin, and then did brain scans with them and examined what actually happens in the brain, which is quite interesting, what happens in the brain. And then a professor in America at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Griffith, he for the first time was able to prove that psilocybin, proof in clinical tests that psilocybin works against severe depression, works for cancer patients, to work with the fear and to work with the problem of dying. Basically, he used this with patients who were terminally ill, and he got good results, good responses. So this is this Griffith professor, together with the Swiss professor, they kind of started what is now our current psychedelic renaissance, with like startups coming up everywhere trying to develop medicines. Like it could be like a new boom, like similar like to the internet boom a few decades ago. Pharmaceutical companies can be very helpful to develop medicines, psychedelic medicines against illnesses that have no other cure, like dementia, which is a growing disease. Some people call it the pandemic of our near future. Like traumas, the amount of people that are traumatized and that need medication is vast. A lot of people take psychotics, antidepressants. A lot of these people could probably just take LSD for a few times in their life and change their disease. So the psychedelic dawn is, I would say it's now, but technically speaking, it's already a few decades old. But I still think we're at the very beginning of understanding these compounds, and especially by understanding how we can utilize them to the best for our society and for the people.
And like many people, you have a personal agenda here. I know you write in the book about your mother, who you think might have also benefited from LSD. Explain, I don't really understand, Norman, why Sandoz didn't develop it. I mean, whether or not it was made illegal in the United States, why was LSD made illegal in Switzerland or Germany after the war?
Well, Albert Hoffmann, I found a note of him. He was chief chemist of Sandoz, and he wrote a note to the CEO, Arthur Stoll, describing how he would like to expand the research on LSD to basically all compounds, all kinds of psychedelic compounds. Like you can, change the molecule of LSD. You can LSD is not the only molecule that's interesting. So he wanted to transform the Sandoz company into a pharmaceutical company specializing on psychedelic medicines. And it makes all the sense in the world if we look at it from today. But I also found a note by Stoll, the CEO, rejecting this proposal. So it was a conscious decision by the CEO of Sandoz in the early 50s to not go down this route.
So it wasn't made illegal. So sorry to interrupt, Norman. It wasn't as if LSD was made illegal in Switzerland. It was a decision within Sandoz, the large Swiss pharmaceutical, not to develop it. Weren't there other pharmaceutical companies around the world that could have developed it?
Well, Sandoz had the patent.
Oh, I see.
There's an interesting meeting that takes place between a CIA executive and Arthur Stoll in his office in Basel in the early 50s. And after this meeting, Sandoz stops the development of LSD as a medicine. And this meeting was led by the head of the MK Ultra program within the CIA. This is
right, and I want to get to MK Ultra, which is one of the hearts of your book. A lot of people be familiar with the movie on MK Ultra. Tell us what this was and how this fits into your narrative. Well,
the director of the FBI, of the CIA, sorry, he was very much concerned with what he called brain warfare. He thought that the Cold War, the confrontation with the Soviet Union, was a confrontation of the minds, was a confrontation of ideologies. So he thought that LSD as a potential secret weapon could be helpful in this war. He said, this war is not fun. This war is serious. Like, we have to fight with everything we can. It is a sort of propaganda war, and often enough, it flared up into a hot war, like the Korean War was part of the Cold War. So it was the Cold War is a war. So he decided that the CIA would create a secret program, even secret within the secrecy of the intelligence service, called MK Ultra. This was led by Sidney Gottlieb, who was an outsider who came into the CIA to direct this program. And Sidney Gottlieb was very interested in LSD because LSD was, there was a Harvard professor named Beecher who was employed by the US military to write about possible truth
Henry
theory.
Knowles Beecher, who is related to Harriet Beecher. It's a complicated, tangled, and ironic story.
Well, Beecher was a military man. He had been in the war in World War II, and then he was back in Harvard, and he received those reports from the Dachau concentration camp. Like, they landed on his desk. The U.S. military asked him to evaluate this, so he became a leading expert on LSD, and he said LSD can be used as a weapon. For example, you could drug a warship of the enemy. Like, if you were able to, administer LSD into the water tanks, then they would all be, incapable of operating the ship, which is probably true. I mean, it's a crazy fantasy, but it was a time of crazy fantasies. Or you could perhaps poison the water supply of a whole city like turn the citizens of Moscow, like make them mad by giving them all LSD, or you could maybe put LSD in the water supply of the Kremlin. I mean, these were all thoughts that Beecher entertained, and Sidney Gottlieb read these Beecher reports, and he thought these Beecher reports are interesting. And what is not good, he thought, was that LSD was being manufactured by a Swiss company from a neutral country, Switzerland. What if Sandoz sells LSD also to the Soviet Union? So he traveled to Basel. He put Stoll under pressure. He said, you have to basically partner up with us. Otherwise, you will have severe problems with the law in the United States, also selling your other products. LSD will not be sold freely on the market. That's what he tried to enforce. And Stoll, he basically agreed to this, I call it, I guess, devilish pact in my book. So to this pact for sure, which enabled then the CIA, Sidney Gottlieb, to become kind of the godfather of LSD and to tailor now the research that was done on LSD to find out how you could manipulate someone's mind with LSD, basically, how you could execute mind control through the use of LSD. Using
and it's ironic. The more you talk about this, Norman, it adds a sort of an odd narrative to the American paranoia and counter paranoia of the age. When you think of movies like Dr. Strangelove and The Manchurian Candidate, it's almost as if LSD was being used in those films without acknowledgement.
Well, I guess it was the spirit of the time. So movies like Dr. Strangelove, they kind of like the director or the writer, they kind of get the sense that something is odd, and of course something is odd in the 50s in the United States. I mean, something is odd also in other countries, but it was a time of deception, a time of paranoia, a time of fear. Suddenly the Soviet Union had the nuclear bomb. So part of this paranoia is also, understandable, but it's certainly interesting to see how LSD also got, in German we say, under the wheels of this paranoia. Like, it didn't get the chance to develop as it should have been able to develop as a medicine because of this pressure cooker of paranoia of the Cold War era.
And what about the Soviets here? Were they the grown-ups? Did they keep their hands off LSD, or did they have their own research, and was the KGB plotting to steal?
Actually,
to steal it and put it in the water supply of London or New York?
It's an interesting question, because this question kind of tormented Sidney Gottlieb's mind, because obviously he was thinking they must have it also, and so the whole drug psychedelic program of the CIA was always under the idea of maybe the Soviets are doing this, so we have to be prepared. Actually, the Soviets, it was never proven that this research was done within the Soviet Union, but interestingly enough, there was quite a large research program involving LSD in Czechoslovakia, which was a satellite state of the Soviet Union. There's a lot in archives in Prague about the psychedelic research on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I have not examined this data. It's all in Czech, in Czech language. I don't know if it was contained to Czechoslovakia, or whether people in Moscow, were getting all the results and were actually also plotting to use LSD as a secret weapon. But Czechoslovakia had their own pharmaceutical company which produced very good, or let's say pure LSD, and it had actually quite an influence on the Czech cultural development. Like, movies coming out of Czechoslovakia in the 60s were much more advanced and dark and funny than movies coming out of other Eastern Bloc countries. I think this would be an interesting research in itself. I have not done this research yet, but Sidney Gottlieb's fears that there was something going on the other side of the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, it is
were
interesting. Maybe
were not ungrounded at all.
Yeah, maybe someone needs to write a book about Milos Forman and Loves
It
of
is
a Blonde and their
interesting.
use of LSD. It also, you know, you could
There's a
rename William Brewer's book, The Red Arrow, gives it new meaning. And what about, you know, you seem ambivalent about this. What about the ambivalence of, I mean, this is A Brave New World, and of course, the author of Brave New World, Arthur Koestler, warned about drugs in that book, but at the same time, he was a pioneer of LSD. When did this become central to the counterculture, and particularly the Californian counterculture?
Very interesting topic. John Lennon once commented, "We have to thank the CIA because they gave us LSD." I mean, what the CIA did, what Gottlieb did, he opened Pandora's box. He never anticipated that LSD might cause a creative revolution, that the Beatles would suddenly become a different band after they had taken LSD and make much more sophisticated albums. You can actually see that, for example, the Beatles have like two phases. Before they took LSD, they were like the nice Beatles, and suddenly they become these psychedelic mavericks who kind of churn out like very different music and who engage themselves in the peace movement, and suddenly become in a way dangerous to the American establishment who was leading war in Vietnam. That's, for example, why Elvis Presley got very worried, because he was supporting the Vietnam War, and he accused the Beatles of coming into the United States and spreading their peace ideas and spreading that the promiscuous drug use, which obviously the Beatles were using these substances, but it was not only the Beatles. So how did it actually spill out of the Pandora's box? Is simply because there were more and more test subjects. Ken Kesey, the novelist, called himself a guinea pig when he was receiving his first dose of LSD as part of a CIA test. He was doing this in Menlo Park, California, working in a psychiatric ward, taking LSD. I think he got $75 from the U.S. government, from the CIA, for taking part in this experiment. And suddenly on LSD, he had like an idea for a novel, which was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, famously turned into a movie by Milos Forman, starring Jack Nicholson, who was also very fond of LSD. So suddenly this LSD like spread around like bohemian circles, because you take LSD, you have different ideas, you can write novels, you can make crazy movies. Ken Kesey called this the revolt of the guinea pig. So you are a guinea pig, you take LSD, you realize, oh my God, this is actually great, and you're going to take it again, and you're going to spread the word. So it got out of hand, basically. And the problem probably was, especially for the U.S. government, that there were no regulations. Like, people were using it, and it's a very potent substance. So people were developing ideas that were not corresponding to the official, ideas that, especially, for example, President Nixon had with the war in Vietnam. So that's when LSD
That's
became
fascinating
a
stuff.
problem
It
for the
reflects
American
the incompetence, which isn't great news, of the American security state. And then to sort of bring this all up to date, you mentioned Ken Kesey. He was a friend of Stuart Brand. We've done some shows on Stuart Brand. He was one of the mainstream figures who connected the counterculture and cyberspace. Steve Jobs, of course, famously took LSD, and some of the early other pioneers of technology and computers and the internet. Did the culture, the revolt of the guinea pig, as Kesey put it, has it somehow been incorporated into the internet and the digital revolution? Is that where we see the real legacy of this countercultural revolution today in 2024?
Or there is widespread psychedelic use among the pioneers, for example, of the web. The Whole Earth catalog was done by someone who was interested.
Yeah, that was Stuart Brand, who
right.
done a show with John Markoff. Just wrote a very interesting biography of Brand, who was a friend of Kesey.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Steve Jobs once said that he was envisioning the desktop computer while he was on LSD. So LSD, I mean, taking LSD in the brain, I mean, it's interesting. I'm coming back to the results of Professor Vollenweider at the clinic, university clinic in Zurich. He found out that on LSD, the brain has a different way of, it has a different energetic distribution. The default mode network, the ego, the command center of the brain receives a little bit less energy, and that while the brain is on LSD, and that has the effect that other parts of the brain, peripheral parts of the brain, can act, like have more space to act, can think, can connect amongst each other. So they're not all under the wing of the central command center, who basically organizes our life. And it's very important that we have this command center in our brain who tells us, in what situation we're in. Like, that's the sober, that saves us a lot of energy if we kind of, if a guy in our head tells us like what's actually going on. But if that guy kind of is put down a little bit by LSD, and other parts of the brain start becoming very creative, obviously we have new ideas and something like connectivity, and maybe we can all connect through computers. Like, that's a typical idea you might have on psychedelics, because it's all about new connections and new connectivity. So the internet is kind of a mirror what actually goes on within the brain on psychedelics.